Hey guys, how's it going? Last week you guys seemed to really enjoy my first attempt at research on this channel where we looked at some statistics around non-reptile keepers' viewpoint on keeping reptiles after watching a recent controversial video on YouTube, which was a big talk on a lot of Facebook groups. So we're gonna continue that trend on this Monday and look at a recent Florida Fish and Wildlife meeting, the one that ultimately ended up banning tegus and iguanas. We'll talk about that a little bit more, but there were some concerns about this meeting and how it was operated and whether each group was really allotted the same amount of time. So let's get to it. Let's do some research, guys. Hey guys, how's it going? You know, it's the beginning of a new year. I'll be completely bald. Yellow Ackie, Reptile. So one particular concern during that Florida Fish and Wildlife meeting, voiced by various individuals during that session, was those for the regulations were getting significantly more time to speak, particularly at the beginning of the session. So I wanted to look and answer a couple questions surrounding that. Those questions are: one, did Florida Fish and Wildlife give those not opposing the regulations more time to speak? And two, did Florida Fish and Wildlife front load those who were not opposing the regulations in these call sessions? And front load meaning, did they take their calls first? Did they put primarily most of those speaking for the regulations and wanting them before those speaking against them? Well, in order to get answers to these two research questions, I spent several long hours annotating and collecting data on the 3-minute caller segment of the recent Florida Fish and Wildlife meeting that happened on February 25th. Basically, after a presentation on the invasive species problem in Florida, the committee opened up a 2-hour window for caller responses. This is basically anybody who wanted to give feedback to the problem before they voted on it. This was initially a 2-hour window. It did open up for an additional hour. I only analyzed the first 2 hours though, because those were 3-minute segments, meaning each caller had 3 minutes to respond. The last hour was a 2-minute segment, so there was a little difference in total time allotted. I didn't want to mix the two together, so this was just the first 2 hours. And again, just want to reiterate that this was the meeting that resulted in over a dozen reptile species being added to the prohibited species list in Florida, including that of tegus and green iguanas. Now, as for the first research question of did Florida Fish and Wildlife give those 4 regulations more overall time to respond, it actually quite surprised me. I really thought there was more leniency in time for those who were for regulations than those opposed, but that was not the case. Before I go on, I just want to let you guys know that this does get juicier, so stay with me. Only 2 people who were for regulations ended up going over time. For comparison, the group of those who opposed these regulations, 10 people went over time. Oh, do things get a little bit more interesting though as we look at the total amount of time that each group went over 3 minutes. The group of callers opposing these regulations did spend more time over the 3-minute mark than those for regulations, but not by much. Basically, the group for regulations spent a total amount of time of 4 minutes and 25 seconds over the 3-minute mark, and the group opposing the regulations spent a total amount of time of 5 minutes and 4 seconds over that mark. That is not that difference of a range, especially when comparing 2 versus 10 people. In fact, it's not even statistically significant, meaning that at 95% confidence, we cannot truly say that there is a difference more than 0 between these 2 means, even though these are 2 different numbers. This little bit of information helped me form the second research question, that of did Florida Fish and Wildlife front load non-opposing callers? I really just wanted to find out where these 2 people who were for regulations went over time in this 2-hour window. So I did a bar plot, and it's actually pretty interesting. This is a bar plot of those 4 regulations and their total amount of time speaking in seconds. Now you can see on the x-axis, it jumps around a little bit, and that's because this is in the context of all callers, including those who are opposing. So you see number 1, that's the first person to speak in this 2-hour window, and that goes to number 37, and it jumps around a little bit because obviously not all of 1 through 37 were speaking for regulations. Now you can obviously see though that the largest time speaking was that of numbers 1 and 2, the first 2 people to talk. So that was very interesting to me. Before investigating further, I did back out a little bit and looked at a linear regression model of the entire data set. Basically, I used machine learning to see the best possible trend line to explain the times of each group, for and against. You can see here that those in the positive group, those for regulations, start higher and go lower as time goes on, while those in the negative group, those against regulations, start lower and go higher as time goes on. This basically says that the group for regulations spoke longer in the beginning of the call segment, while the group against regulations spoke longer as the call segment went on. I did look at one more chart before moving on. I looked at the first 10 callers and their call times. This chart showed that a larger amount of people for regulations were chosen to speak than those against, and they spent much more time doing so. Before getting to the final results and conclusion, I would really appreciate if you guys subscribe in the lower right hand corner, hit that bell as well for the latest updates on the channel. Thanks guys. Interestingly, over a third of all callers for regulations, 37%, called within the first 10 callers. That's the first 24 minutes and 20 seconds of the call segment. Better yet, those for regulations took up 73% of the first 24 minutes of the call segment and 100% of the first 17 minutes. On average, those for regulations in the first 10 callers took 2 minutes and 59 seconds to speak, while those who were against regulations in the first 10 callers took 2 minutes and 8 seconds to speak. In conclusion, it seems to me that Florida Fish and Wildlife front-loaded callers of those for regulations. Now, you may say, does that matter? Well, yes, it does. This exact thing actually plays a huge role in bias, especially in voting-oriented scenarios. First is the problem of anchoring bias, where an individual relies too heavily on the first thing they hear. Not only did the meeting start with a heavily biased presentation on invasive species in Florida, but continued with a lot of for regulation individuals. Then come biases like hindsight bias or confirmation bias, which make it easier for people to believe things they already believe or predict. Additionally, we have the illusory truth effect, which is a huge area of study. The illusory truth effect is the tendency of an individual to believe things they continuously hear, often false information. While it's hard to say all of these play a role in this scenario, or even some do, it's also hard to say they do not. And when you're talking about a committee voting directly after listening to feedback on an issue, feedback that started with confirming support for these regulations, it is hard not to believe that at least some of their minds were made up by the time opposition rhetoric came through. So guys, what do you think? Do you think Florida Fish and Wildlife potentially front-loaded those in support of this regulation? Because it kind of seems like it. Even without all these statistics and numbers, just replaying the recording or being there, you got the sense of it. I will put the recording, there's two, part 1 and 2. Part 1 is the one you probably mostly want to focus on. I will put that in the description below. You can check it out if you want to. But ultimately, I would love to hear your feedback in a comment. Do you think this was a good investigation? Do you think it was a waste of time? Let me know, guys. Couple announcements before we wrap up. I want to welcome new patron No Stupid Questions. Thanks so much for your support. I also want to shout out Kat and Rick, Darian J, Smooth Cat, Adam B, Angela L, David T, Ellen M, Stephanie S, Brandon G, Hex, and Crisp Cuts. I appreciate your support so much. You guys too can be patrons for as little as $1 a month. Check the top right for information. Tier 3 gets you on my forehead. Get $5 off your first purchase of Reptilinks by using code Professor Herp at checkout. Reptilinks is a great nutritious diet for hognose snakes, blue-tongued skinks, tegus, and more. I definitely recommend them. Code Professor Herp at checkout. And that's it, guys. Please leave a comment and like. Subscribe if you haven't. Check out the Teespring that's to the left of my head, right of your screen. Teespring link in the description below. And I will see you guys in the next video. Bye, everyone.